I started wrestling when I was about 6 years old. I've come up through every age group. I was a place winner in the Junior World Championships. I've won the Pan Am Games, 13 international tournament wins, traveled the world, but never did make an Olympic team. I was an Olympic alternate in '92. Well, the basis behind the movie is Mark Shultz's story about his relationship with John DuPont. And his brother Dave, who was murdered by DuPont, is really kind of just a part of the film. So it's Hollywood taking, their license to try to put together a movie. Now, the acting in the movie itself is fantastic. The timeline doesn't actually make sense because they kind of have Dave getting shot in 1988, and it didn't happen until 1996. And unfortunately, never did Mark and Dave live on the farm together. So those are the few little things that are different in the movie than real life. But there were a group of us that lived out there. We trained full-time. John DuPont, who was the largest stockholder of DuPont Chemicals and a direct descendant of E.I. DuPont, who started the company, he was a philanthropist. He liked to help out athletics. He had a swimming team at one time. He helped out modern pentathlon, and he had a fascination for wrestling. He started a wrestling program at a college, but it didn't last more than 2 years, and because he enjoyed that, he decided to start his own wrestling program and built one of the nicest wrestling rooms in the world right on his 800 acres of land. And there were 5 of us that lived out there, but there were probably 60 of us that were part of the team, and guys that filtered in and out of the place. And we had really the reason why I went out there, because I was 7 years a college wrestling coach. I coached at Northwestern University, University of Minnesota. And the reason why I went out there is because to try to be a college wrestling coach and train is very difficult. And there were very few opportunities for any of us to train full-time, and Foxcatcher was one of them. And my very good friend Dave Shultz was living out there, and he was by far the best wrestling coach in the country. And I also had the best workout partner in the world in Valentin Giordanov. He's a Bulgarian who was the most decorated freestyle wrestler in our weight class ever. Olympic champion, 7-time world champion, etc. So the advantages of living out there were immense, and obviously DuPont treated us very well before all this happened. And it was after listening to a lot of interviews. Dave's widow Nancy is doing a documentary and interviewed a lot of guys, and after it came down to it, it really was John DuPont being paranoid, schizophrenic, thinking that somebody was after him and thought Dave Shultz was harboring that individual and took revenge on him before it could happen to him. But he was mentally ill. He had a cocaine problem and a drinking problem, and that all culminated into a murder. Yeah, and again, because Mark never lived out there at the same time I did, what his real relationship with John was like, I have no idea. I know that John wanted to, he really, in his heart, thought he was helping wrestling, and he wanted to give these opportunities to us. And Mark was part of that, and unfortunately, there was a lot of outside portion to this. John, there was a lot of drama because, John DuPont had a lot of not only mental problems but physical problems, and you had to deal with that if you were out there training as well. And unfortunately for Mark, it culminated in him not winning the 1988 Olympics when he had won the World Championships the year before. He was by far the best guy in the world, but a lot of the training that he was doing was negative, and he wasn't training with his brother, who was the best, was an Olympic champion 4 years before, and was a world champion a couple years before. So it's the living on the farm was sometimes taxing, but there were a lot of advantages to it. My training partner, Valentin Giordanov, was brought over because he was widely regarded as one of the greatest wrestlers ever. And John DuPont had quite a fascination with that. John really was a failed athlete that wanted, he wanted to be good, and he lived vicariously through the guys that he coached. But the guys that he funded. And obviously Vallow was the best of all of us. So after after Dave was murdered, John went to jail, and he died in jail a few years ago. But while he was in there, a couple of guys went to see him and kept a relationship with him. And that's probably one of the reasons why when DuPont died, he left all of his money. Well, not all of his money. He donated some of it, but the brunt of it went to Valentin Jordanov. No, and again, they cut out that whole timeline, between 1988 and 1996 to make the movie work. Because again, Mark and Dave never lived together on the farm. So, Bennett Miller, who's the director of the movie and a great guy, he had to try to figure out how to put them together. And Mark was not there the day that Dave died. There were 5 of us that were. I spoke with both John DuPont and Dave Shultz that day, and it didn't seem like there was any irritation going on anywhere. So for this to happen was quite the shock for all of us. Well, and it was kind of a tough situation because that, the whole murder and everything about it changed all of our lives. Our training went out the door. We had no more funding. We started a wrestling club, and a lot of people came to bat for us and got us enough money that we could train through the Olympic trials. But none of the guys that lived out there made the Olympic team. It was kind of emotional, and it was pretty tough to continue to train the way we had been. So once that was all done, I moved back to Chicago, and I had been a college wrestling coach for 7 years, and I thought maybe I would go back into that, but there weren't any opportunities. So unfortunate for me, I didn't have any money. I needed to get a job. And a friend of my uncle's had offered me a job, and I took it, and I've been doing it ever since. So I'm primarily a salesman for one of the largest heating companies in Chicago, but I do quite a bit of coaching, and I'm in a gym in Naperville, Illinois, at least 4 days a week, and just trying to teach high school kids and grade school kids to be good. Well, you got to understand that most of the original UFC fighters all had a wrestling background. Dan Severn, who was a champ, Dan Severn and I were on a team together. We wrestled in Turkey and Bulgaria together. And then he retired and he went into fighting and eventually was a UFC champion, one of the very first. One of the locals that lives around me, a friend of mine, Keith Hackney. Keith was one of the original UFC guys that fought bare-knuckled, and he's widely considered the giant killer. He defeated a 370-pound black guy that he was half his size, and broke his hand doing it. But MMA back in those days was more. It wasn't controlled. It was more like a street fight, and they've organized it, and they've changed the rules a bit and made it more like a little boxing and jiu-jitsu. And, before it was just street fighting, and that's why, Gracie was so good in the early days is because he was the only guy that had a jiu-jitsu background. So now the well-honed MMA guy has all those skills, including wrestling. To be a well-rounded fighter, I think wrestling plays a big part in it. Some of the Foxcatcher athletes actually had fought and had won. Mark Coleman, who actually wrestled for our club. He didn't live out there, but he wrestled for the club. He was a UFC champ. Mark Kerr fought for a UFC title. A few other guys had fought, and like you said, Mark Shultz, actually, I think he only fought once and he won. That was it. I don't know why he stopped.